Officer Bradley Thompson had been on the force for nearly 9 years, and he thought he'd seen everything. Traffic stops, domestic disputes, late-night bar fights, nothing surprised him anymore. He'd developed what he called a sixth sense about people. Within seconds of pulling someone over, he could tell if they were going to be cooperative or difficult, or so he believed. That Tuesday morning started like any other. Bradley arrived at the county courthouse 40 minutes early, just as he always did. He liked being prepared, reviewing his notes, making sure every detail was perfect before stepping into the courtroom. His polished badge caught the fluorescent lights as he walked through the metal detector, nodding at the security guard who knew him by name. "Big day, Officer Thompson," the guard asked with a smile. "Just another traffic violation," Bradley replied, holding up his folder. "Should be quick." He made his way to the 3rd floor, his shoes clicking against the marble tile. The courthouse always smelled the same. A mixture of old wood, coffee from the vending machines, and something else he could never quite place. Maybe it was just the weight of all the decisions made within these walls. Bradley found a bench outside courtroom 3B and sat down to review his notes one more time. The case was straightforward. 3 weeks ago, he'd pulled over a woman for running a red light at the intersection of Oak and 5th Street. She'd been driving a silver sedan, going at least 15 miles over the speed limit even before she blew through that light. What annoyed him most was her attitude. When he'd approached her window, she'd immediately started making excuses. Something about an emergency, about needing to get somewhere quickly. Bradley had heard it all before. Everyone had an excuse. Everyone thought their situation was special, that the rules didn't apply to them. He'd given her the ticket and she'd taken it without much more argument. But there was something in her eyes. Not anger exactly, more like disappointment. It had bothered him for a moment, but he'd shaken it off. He was just doing his job. The law was the law. Now, as he sat reviewing his notes, he heard footsteps approaching. Looking up, he saw her. The woman from the traffic stop. She was wearing dark gray pants and a cream-colored blouse, carrying a leather briefcase that looked expensive. Her hair was pulled back neatly and she wore minimal jewelry, just a watch and small earrings. Bradley stood up immediately. He recognized her face even though it had been weeks. Something about police work made you remember faces, especially the ones who gave you trouble. "Excuse me," he called out, stepping into her path. "You're here for the traffic violation case, right?" "Courtroom 3B?" The woman stopped and looked at him. For a moment he thought he saw recognition in her eyes, but her expression remained calm, almost neutral. "Yes, that's correct," she said simply. Bradley felt that familiar surge of authority. This was his territory, his element. He'd testified in dozens of cases, and he knew how these things went. Most people were nervous, anxious about facing a judge. This was his chance to set the tone, to make sure she understood the seriousness of what she'd done. "Look," he said, his voice taking on that firm quality he'd perfected over the years. "I remember you from the stop. You weren't very cooperative then, and I want to make sure we're clear on the facts before we go in there." The woman adjusted her briefcase to her other hand. "Officer, I appreciate your diligence, but perhaps we should save this discussion for inside the courtroom." Bradley shook his head. "I don't think you understand how serious this is. Running a red light isn't just a minor infraction. You could have caused an accident. Someone could have been hurt." He was warming up now, falling into the lecture he'd given countless times. "I see drivers like you every day. People who think traffic laws are suggestions, not rules." "I understand your concern," the woman replied, her voice still even. "But as I tried to explain at the time—" I know," Bradley interrupted, waving his hand dismissively. "You had some kind of emergency. Everyone has an emergency. If I let everyone off because they claim to have an emergency, there'd be no point in having traffic laws at all." A young lawyer walking by slowed down, clearly listening to the exchange. The woman noticed but didn't seem embarrassed. If anything, she seemed patient. It was odd. Most people in her position would be getting defensive by now, or angry or tearful. She was none of those things. "Officer," she tried again, "I really think we should wait for—" "Look, I'm trying to help you here," Bradley continued. He lowered his voice slightly as if sharing insider information. "Judge Patterson usually handles these cases, and he doesn't go easy on people who waste the court's time. If you plead guilty, explain that you understand what you did wrong and apologize, you'll probably just get a fine and maybe some traffic school. But if you go in there trying to fight this, making excuses, it's not going to go well for you. The woman glanced at her watch. Bradley noticed it was a nice watch, tasteful but clearly not cheap. She probably had a good job, which meant she could afford the fine. He didn't understand why people like her always insisted on fighting these things. "I appreciate the advice," she said carefully, "but I do plan to explain my circumstances to the court." Bradley sighed, frustrated. "Why did people always make things harder than they needed to be?" "That's your choice, but you're making a mistake. I was there. I saw what happened. The facts are the facts, and no amount of explaining is going to change what you did." Another officer walked by. Derek Williams from the East Precinct. "Hey, Bradley," Derek called out. "Ready to make another case?" Bradley grinned and gave him a thumbs up. "Always am." He turned back to the woman, his confidence bolstered by his colleague's presence. "See, I do this all the time. I know how it works. But hey, if you want to learn the hard way, that's your decision." The woman checked her watch again and then looked back toward the courtroom doors. "Officer Thompson," she said, and he was briefly surprised she remembered his name from the ticket. "I need to go inside now. I'm sure we'll have a chance to discuss all of this very soon." There was something in the way she said it, something he couldn't quite read. But he dismissed the feeling. He was good at reading people, and she was clearly just another person who thought she could talk her way out of a ticket. "Fine," Bradley said, stepping aside. "But don't say I didn't warn you. When you're standing in front of Judge Patterson trying to explain yourself, you're going to wish you'd listened to me." The woman gave him a slight nod, not quite a smile, not quite acknowledgement of his point, just something. Then she walked past him toward the courtroom entrance. Bradley watched her go, then checked his own watch. 15 minutes until the session started. He'd grab a coffee from the machine down the hall, maybe chat with Derek for a few minutes. This case would probably be over in 10 minutes once they got started. He had no idea that in less than half an hour, his entire understanding of that morning and possibly his entire approach to his job was about to be turned completely upside down. The woman walking away from him wasn't just another defendant, trying to dodge a ticket. She was about to take the judge's seat in Bradley. Thompson was about to learn the most important lesson of his career. Bradley took a sip of his terrible courthouse coffee and made his way back to courtroom 3B. Derek had wished him luck, though Bradley didn't think he needed it. This was routine. He'd testified in traffic cases probably 100 times before, maybe more. As he pushed open the heavy wooden door to the courtroom, he immediately noticed something felt different. There was an unusual buzz in the air. The court clerk was arranging papers on the judge's bench with more care than usual. A few lawyers were whispering to each other near the back row, glancing toward the front of the room with curious expressions. Bradley took his usual spot near the witness stand. He nodded to Jennifer Park, the prosecutor he'd worked with on dozens of cases. She was shuffling through files but looked up when she saw him. "Morning, Bradley," she said, and there was something odd in her voice, almost like she was holding back a smile. "Morning," he replied. "Judge Patterson running late?" Jennifer pressed her lips together. "Patterson's not coming. We have a visiting judge today." "Oh." Bradley shrugged. It didn't matter to him. He'd worked with plenty of judges over the years. Some were stricter than others, but the facts were the facts. A red light violation was pretty cut and dry. "Anyone I know?" "You could say that," Jennifer replied, and this time she definitely was smiling. But before Bradley could ask what she meant, the bailiff stood up. "All rise." Bradley stood automatically, straightening his uniform. He watched the door behind the bench, expecting to see an older judge in black robes emerge from the chambers. That's how it always went. The door would open, the judge would walk in, everyone would sit down, and they'd get started. But the door didn't open. Instead, there was movement at the front of the courtroom. Someone was walking toward the bench from the public area. Bradley's eyes followed the figure, and his stomach suddenly dropped like he'd missed a step going downstairs. It was her, the woman from the hallway, the woman he'd just lectured for 15 minutes about how she needed to plead guilty and not waste the court's time. She walked calmly past the defendant's table, her leather briefcase in hand. She didn't look at Bradley, didn't look at anyone, really. She just walked straight to the judge's bench and climbed the 3 steps to the elevated platform. Bradley felt his mouth go dry. This had to be some kind of mistake. Maybe she was a court assistant? Maybe she was delivering something to the judge? But no, She was opening her briefcase now, taking out files and arranging them on the bench. She settled into the high-backed leather chair with the ease of someone who'd done it many times before. The bailiff's voice rang out clearly through the courtroom. "All rise for the Honorable Judge Rebecca Hayes presiding." The words hit Bradley like a physical blow. Judge. She was a judge. The woman he'd been lecturing in the hallway. The woman whose ticket he'd written. The woman he'd told not to waste Judge Patterson's time. She was the judge. He felt the blood drain from his face. His collar suddenly felt too tight. He reached up instinctively to loosen his tie, then stopped himself. "Don't fidget. Stay professional." Maybe she didn't remember. Maybe, but of course she remembered. How could she not? It had been 20 minutes ago. And from the way Jennifer was carefully studying her notepad, pretending not to notice Bradley's panic, it was clear that other people in the courtroom had heard about his hallway conversation, too. Judge Hayes looked out over the courtroom with a calm, professional expression. She adjusted her reading glasses and opened the first file on her desk. Bradley noticed her hands were steady. Not a hint of nervousness or uncertainty. She belonged in that chair. "Good morning," she said, her voice carrying the natural authority that comes with the position. "I'm Judge Rebecca Hayes. I'll be serving as a visiting judge for this district over the next several weeks while Judge Patterson is on medical leave." Medical leave. So Patterson wasn't just out for the day. This woman, this judge, was going to be here for weeks. Bradley's mind raced. How many cases did he have coming up? How many times would he have to face her after what he'd said in the hallway? "We have several matters on the docket this morning," Judge Hayes continued. "Let's begin with case number 2247, the People versus Mitchell Krause." Not his case. Bradley felt a tiny wave of relief, followed immediately by a wave of dread. She was making him wait, making him sit through other cases, stewing in his embarrassment. Or maybe she wasn't thinking about him at all. Maybe to her he was just another case on the list, and what had happened in the hallway was already forgotten. But he didn't believe that. The way she'd said, "I'm sure we'll have a chance to discuss all of this very soon" in the hallway, there had been meaning in those words. She'd known then what was about to happen. She'd known, and she'd let him keep talking anyway. The first case involved a man who'd been caught shoplifting. Bradley watched as Judge Hayes listened carefully to both the prosecutor and the defense attorney. She asked questions, good questions, the kind that got to the heart of what actually happened. She wanted to know about the man's circumstances, his employment status, whether this was his first offense. "Mr. Krause," she said finally, "I'm not excusing what you did, but I see here that you've been unemployed for 6 months and you were taking food items. I'm going to order community service instead of jail time, and I'm also going to provide you with information about the county's food assistance programs. Use them. That's what they're there for." The man looked stunned, then grateful. "Thank you, Your Honor, I will. I promise." Bradley watched this interaction with growing unease. Judge Hayes wasn't harsh or cold. She was fair, thoughtful even. She treated the shoplifter, someone who'd actually stolen something, with more respect than Bradley had shown her in the hallway. The second case was a minor drug possession charge. Again, Judge Hayes took her time, asked questions, listened to the answers. She seemed genuinely interested in understanding each person who stood before her, not just processing them through the system. During a brief pause while the clerk prepared paperwork, Jennifer leaned over to Bradley. "She's good," she whispered. "Really good. Came highly recommended from the state appellate court." Appellate court. That meant Judge Hayes had been reviewing other judges' decisions, making sure they followed the law correctly. She wasn't just any judge, she was experienced, respected. And Bradley had treated her like she was an idiot who didn't understand how courtrooms worked. He wanted to disappear. Maybe he could fake a sudden illness. No, that would look even worse. He was going to have to sit here and face this. The third case wrapped up quickly. Then the fourth. Bradley glanced at the clock. 45 minutes had passed. How many cases were there before his? Finally, after nearly an hour, Judge Hayes looked up from her files and called out the case number Bradley had been dreading. Case number 2301, the People versus Rebecca Hayes. The courtroom went completely silent. Even the clerk stopped typing. Judge Hayes said the words without any hint of irony or discomfort, as if it were perfectly normal to call out your own name as the defendant. "This is an unusual situation," she continued, her voice steady and professional. As you can see, I am both the presiding judge and the defendant in this traffic violation case. Obviously, I cannot preside over my own case. That would be a clear conflict of interest and a violation of judicial ethics. Bradley felt every eye in the courtroom shift to him. He kept his gaze fixed straight ahead, his face burning. Therefore, Judge Hayes went on, I will be recusing myself from this particular matter. The case will be transferred to Judge Patterson when he returns, or to another visiting judge if one becomes available before then. However, she paused and Bradley's heart hammered in his chest. Officer Thompson is present today, and I believe there are some procedural matters we should address on the record before this case is transferred. She looked directly at him for the first time since taking the bench. Her expression wasn't angry. It wasn't smug. It was simply expectant, like a teacher who'd asked a question and was waiting for a student to answer. Officer Thompson, she said clearly, would you please approach the bench? Bradley's legs felt weak as he stood. The walk from his seat to the bench felt like it took forever. Every step echoed in the silent courtroom. He could feel Jennifer watching him, could feel the other officers who'd come for their cases watching him, could feel everyone watching him. When he reached the bench, Judge Hayes looked down at him from her elevated position. Up close, he could see that her eyes weren't cold or harsh, but they were intelligent, very intelligent, and they missed nothing. Officer Thompson, she said quietly, but her voice still carried through the courtroom. I think we need to have a conversation about what happened in the hallway this morning, don't you? Bradley swallowed hard. This was it. Whatever came next would define not just this case, but possibly his entire career. He opened his mouth to speak, and the whole courtroom waited to hear what he would say. Bradley stood before the bench, his heart pounding so hard he was sure everyone in the courtroom could hear it. Judge Hayes was looking at him with an expression that was difficult to read. Not angry, not amused, just waiting. Giving him space to speak, he knew he had two choices in this moment. He could try to downplay what had happened in the hallway, pretend it wasn't a big deal, act like he'd just been doing his job. Or he could be honest. Really honest. The kind of honest that made you vulnerable and exposed. Bradley had spent 9 years building up walls, developing that tough cop exterior that kept people at a distance. It had served him well on the streets in dangerous situations where hesitation could cost you. But standing here in this courtroom, looking up at a judge he'd disrespected less than 2 hours ago, those walls suddenly felt like the worst kind of prison. Your Honor, he began, and his voice came out rougher than he intended. He cleared his throat and started again. Your Honor, I need to address what I did in the hallway before court started. Judge Hayes nodded slightly, encouraging him to continue. I approached you outside this courtroom, Bradley said, forcing himself to maintain eye contact even though everything in him wanted to look away. I questioned you about the traffic stop. I lectured you about traffic safety and about how you should handle yourself in court. I interrupted you when you tried to speak. I was dismissive and condescending. The courtroom was so quiet that Bradley could hear the wall clock ticking. Nobody was moving. Even the clerk had stopped shuffling papers. I did all of that, Bradley continued, without knowing who you were. And I think... He paused, struggling to find the right words. I think that's actually what makes it worse. Because I should have treated you with respect regardless of who you were. Whether you're a judge or a teacher or someone who works at the grocery store, it doesn't matter. I was out of line. Judge Hayes leaned back slightly in her chair, her expression thoughtful. Go on, she said simply. Bradley felt sweat forming on his forehead despite the courtroom's air conditioning. I've been a police officer for 9 years. I've pulled over hundreds of people, maybe thousands, and somewhere along the way I stopped seeing them as people. I started seeing them as violations, as problems to be solved, as people who were wasting my time with their excuses. He glanced down at his hands, then forced himself to look back up at the judge. That traffic stop 3 weeks ago, when I pulled you over for running that red light, you tried to tell me nothing. You tried to explain the situation, and I didn't listen. I literally didn't listen. I wrote down that you said something about an emergency, but I didn't actually hear you. I didn't care what you had to say because I'd already decided you were just another person trying to get out of a ticket. Jennifer, the prosecutor, was watching him with an expression he'd never seen from her before. It wasn't pity exactly, but something close to it. Or maybe it was respect. He couldn't tell. Officer Thompson, Judge Hayes said, her voice measured and calm. What was I trying to tell you that day? Do you remember now? Bradley pulled out his notepad with shaking hands. He flipped to the page with his notes from that traffic stop. His handwriting stared back at him, and for the first time, he actually read what he'd written instead of just seeing it. According to my notes, he said slowly, you stated that you ran the red light because you were responding to an emergency call, a domestic violence situation. He looked up, realization washing over him like cold water. You said you were off duty, but you heard the call go out and you were closer than the responding units. That's correct, Judge Hayes confirmed. What else does your report say? Bradley scanned the page, his stomach sinking further with every word. It says you stopped at the intersection first to make sure it was clear before proceeding through the red light, and that you immediately slowed down and pulled over when you saw my lights. And despite all of that information, which you documented yourself, Judge Hayes said, what did you conclude? Bradley's voice was barely above a whisper. I concluded that you were just making excuses, that everyone claims to have an emergency. I gave you the ticket and told you to explain it to the court, which is actually the correct procedure, Judge Hayes pointed out. Police officers aren't judges. You write the citation and let the court sort out the circumstances. That part you did right. For a moment, Bradley felt a flicker of relief, but Judge Hayes wasn't finished. The problem, Officer Thompson, isn't that you gave me the ticket. The problem is that you had already judged me. In your mind, I was guilty. I was someone who thought the rules didn't apply to them, and that judgment carried forward to this morning, when you decided to interrogate me in the hallway and tell me how I should plead in my own case. Bradley nodded slowly. You're right. That's exactly what I did. Why? Judge Hayes asked, and it wasn't a rhetorical question. She genuinely seemed to want to know. Why did you feel the need to approach me before court? Why not just let the process work the way it's supposed to work? That was the real question, wasn't it? Bradley thought about it, really thought about it, probably for the first time. Because I wanted to be in control, he finally admitted. When I'm out on the street, I'm the authority. People listen to me because they have to. But in court, I'm just a witness. I don't get to make the decisions. The judge does. And I think I was trying to influence the outcome before we even got started. By intimidating the defendant, Judge Hayes said flatly. Yes, Bradley admitted. By intimidating the defendant. A lawyer in the back of the courtroom shifted in his seat. Another officer who'd been waiting for his case looked down at his hands. Everyone in that room was understanding something they'd probably always known, but never quite acknowledged. That the way police officers treated people outside the courtroom mattered just as much as what happened inside it. Judge Hayes was quiet for a long moment. Then she said something that surprised everyone. Officer Thompson, before I became a judge, I was a police officer for 6 years. Bradley's eyes widened. He hadn't known that. I worked patrol in the North District, she continued. I did traffic stops, domestic calls, everything you do. So I understand the job. I understand the frustration of dealing with people who lie to your face. I understand the exhaustion of working long shifts and writing report after report. I understand how easy it is to become cynical, to stop seeing individuals and start seeing categories of problems. She paused, letting that sink in. But I also learned something important during those 6 years. Every single person I encountered, whether they were a victim or a suspect or just someone I pulled over for a broken taillight, deserved to be treated like a human being. Not because they earned it, but because that's what the badge requires of us. Bradley felt something crack inside his chest. Maybe it was pride. Maybe it was the wall he'd built up over 9 years. Whatever it was, he felt it breaking. I made a choice when I became a judge, Hayes continued. I decided that I would listen to every person who came before me. Really listen. Not because I'm soft on crime or because I don't believe in accountability, but because justice requires understanding. You can't judge what you don't understand. She looked at Bradley with an expression that was somehow both firm and kind. You're not a bad police officer, Bradley. Your record shows dozens of commendations. You show up early. You write thorough reports. You care about doing things right. But caring about procedure isn't the same as caring about people. And somewhere along the way you forgot that the people you encounter are more than just the worst moment of their day. Bradley felt his throat tighten. He wanted to defend himself, to explain that he dealt with difficult people every day, that you had to have thick skin in this job. But all of that felt hollow now, because Judge Hayes had done the same job, faced the same challenges, and she hadn't let it turn her into someone who stopped listening. So here's what's going to happen, Judge Hayes said, her voice taking on a more formal tone. As I stated earlier, I'm recusing myself from my own case. Judge Patterson or another visiting judge will handle it. And the evidence, including the domestic violence report from that day, will be presented. She paused, and Bradley braced himself for what was coming next. As for your conduct this morning, Officer Thompson, I'm not going to file a formal complaint, though I would be within my rights to do so. Bradley felt his knees nearly buckle with relief. However, Judge Hayes continued, and Bradley's relief vanished. I am going to ask something of you. Bradley held his breath, waiting for Judge Hayes to continue. Whatever she was about to ask him to do, he knew he had no choice but to agree. He'd been given a gift. She wasn't filing a complaint that could end his career. But gifts often came with conditions. I want you to spend 1 day a month observing in this courtroom, Judge Hayes said. Not testifying, not working a case, just sitting and watching. For the next 6 months, Bradley blinked. Of all the things he'd expected her to say, that wasn't it. Observing, Your Honor. Yes, observing. Judge Hayes leaned forward slightly. I want you to see what happens after you write those tickets and make those arrests. I want you to see the full stories of the people you encounter. The context you don't get to see when you're out on the street. Bradley's mind raced. 6 days in a courtroom just sitting and watching. It seemed almost too easy. But then again, maybe that was the point. Maybe the punishment wasn't in the task itself, but in what he'd be forced to confront while doing it. I'll do that, Your Honor, Bradley said. Whatever you think is appropriate. Furthermore, Judge Hayes continued, I'd like you to consider participating in the county's community dialogue program. It's a program where police officers and community members come together to talk about their experiences, their concerns, their fears. It's not mandatory, but I think you'd benefit from it. Community dialogue. Bradley had heard about that program. Some of the younger officers had participated in it. He'd always thought it sounded soft, like something for officers who couldn't handle the real work. But standing here now, facing the consequences of his own hardened attitude, he was beginning to understand that maybe strength wasn't about building walls. Maybe it was about being willing to knock them down. I'll sign up for it, Bradley said. Judge Hayes studied him for a moment, as if trying to determine whether he meant it or if he was just saying what she wanted to hear. Finally, she nodded. Good. See the clerk before you leave today. She'll help you get scheduled for both. Yes, Your Honor. You can return to your seat, Officer Thompson. Bradley walked back to his spot on shaky legs. As he sat down, he caught Jennifer's eye. She gave him a small nod, not quite approval, but acknowledgement. The kind of nod that said, that could have been much worse, and you know it. Judge Hayes moved on to the next case on the docket. It was a young man, maybe 22 or 23, charged with driving without a license. Bradley found himself actually paying attention this time, not just waiting for his turn to testify. The young man explained that his license had been suspended because he couldn't pay a fine from a previous ticket. But without a license, he couldn't drive to work. And without work, he couldn't pay the fine. It was a cycle that seemed impossible to break. Judge Hayes listened carefully. So you were driving to work when you were pulled over? Yes, ma'am. Your Honor. Yes, Your Honor. The young man was nervous, tripping over his words. Where do you work? I work at a warehouse. Night shift. Loading trucks? And there's no public transportation that runs that route at that time? No, Your Honor. The last bus stop's running at 10 and my shift starts at 11. Judge Hayes pulled up something on her computer, reading IF. For a moment. Then she looked back at the young man. I see you've been making partial payments on the original fine. Small amounts, but consistent. Yes, Your Honor. I pay what I can. Bradley watched as Judge Hayes thought for a moment, weighing her options. This was a clear violation. The man had been driving without a license. The law was straightforward, but the circumstances were complicated, messy, human. Here's what I'm going to do, Judge Hayes finally said. I'm going to reduce your fine and put you on a payment plan that's actually manageable based on your income. $25 a month. Can you handle that? The young man's eyes went wide. Yes, Your Honor, I can do that. I'm also going to refer you to the county's hardship license program. If you qualify, you can get a restricted license that allows you to drive to and from work. while you're getting your full license reinstated. No more driving without a license. Understood? Understood, Your Honor. Thank you. Thank you so much. As the young man left the courtroom, practically floating with relief, Bradley felt something shift in his chest. How many times had he pulled someone over, seen they had a suspended license, and immediately assumed they were just irresponsible? How many times had he written the ticket without thinking about the circumstances that led to that moment? The morning continued. Judge Hayes handled case after case with the same careful attention. A woman who'd shoplifted diapers because she'd lost her job, a teenager who'd spray-painted graffiti on a bridge, an older man who'd gotten into a fight outside a bar. Each person had a story. Each story had context, and Judge Hayes listened to all of it. During a brief recess, Derek Williams, the officer who'd greeted Bradley earlier, came over and sat down next to him. "So," Derek said quietly. "I heard what happened," Bradley sighed. "Of course you did. The whole courthouse probably knows by now." "Pretty much," Derek confirmed, but there was no mockery in his voice. "For what it's worth, I think you handled it well. Taking responsibility like that, not everyone would have done that. I didn't have much choice." "You always have a choice," Derek said. "You could have made excuses. Could have tried to minimize it. You didn't," he paused. "You know, I was thinking about signing up for that community dialogue thing anyway. Maybe I'll do it the same time you do. Could be good for both of us." Bradley looked at his colleague with surprise. Derek was a good cop, solid, reliable, fair. If he thought the program was worthwhile, maybe it really was. "Yeah," Bradley said. "That'd be good." When court resumed, Bradley noticed he was watching everything differently now. Judge Hayes called a case involving a DUI, and the arresting officer, someone Bradley knew from the West District, took the stand. The officer gave his testimony in the same confident, matter-of-fact tone that Bradley had used hundreds of times. The defendant had been pulled over for swerving. Field sobriety test administered. Breathalyzer test showed blood alcohol above the legal limit. All by the book. But then Judge Hayes started asking questions. Had the officer noticed anything else about the defendant's condition? Were there any medical conditions that might have affected the field sobriety test? Had the breathalyzer been recently calibrated? The officer seemed annoyed by the questions, as if Judge Hayes was somehow questioning his competence. Bradley recognized that defensiveness. He'd felt it himself many times. But Judge Hayes wasn't attacking the officer. She was just being thorough, making sure all the facts were on the record. In the end, she ruled that the arrest was valid and the evidence was solid. The defendant was found guilty. But Bradley noticed that even as she delivered the verdict, Judge Hayes took time to provide information about substance abuse programs and treatment options. She wasn't just punishing, she was trying to help. When the morning session finally ended, Bradley stood with everyone else as Judge Hayes left the bench. As the courtroom began to empty, he made his way to the clerk's desk. The clerk, an older woman named Mrs. Patterson, no relation to Judge Patterson, as she always had to explain, looked up at him with knowing eyes. "Let me guess," she said. "You need to schedule your observation days and sign up for community dialogue?" Bradley managed a weak smile. "Word travels fast. Honey, in a courthouse, word travels at the speed of light." She pulled out a calendar and a sign-up sheet. "Judge Hayes is tough but fair. She doesn't give these assignments to punish people. She does it because she thinks they can grow from it." "I hope she's right," Bradley said. Mrs. Patterson looked at him over her reading glasses. "I've worked in this courthouse for 32 years. I've seen hundreds of officers come through here. Some of them are just going through the motions, collecting evidence, moving on to the next case. But the really good ones, the ones who make a real difference, they're the ones who never stop learning. Never stop questioning themselves. Never stop trying to be better." She handed him a pen. "Sign here for the observation days. First one is 2 weeks from now. And here for the community dialogue program. First session is next Thursday evening." Bradley signed both forms, his handwriting looking shaky compared to his usual confident script. "Thank you," he said. "Don't thank me. Thank Judge Hayes by actually showing up and paying attention." Mrs. Patterson filed the forms away. "And Officer Thompson? What you did in there today, admitting your mistake, taking responsibility, that took courage. Don't lose that." As Bradley left the courthouse that afternoon, the sunshine felt different somehow. Brighter, sharper, more real. He'd walked into this building thinking he was just dealing with another routine traffic case. He'd leave it with his entire perspective shaken. His phone buzzed. It was a text from his sergeant. Heard about court today. Let's talk tomorrow. Bradley took a deep breath. The consequences of this morning weren't over, but somehow that felt okay. Maybe consequences were just another word for opportunities to learn. He got in his patrol car and sat there for a moment before starting the engine. In 6 months after the observation days and the community dialogue sessions, would he be a different officer? Would he see people differently? Would he listen differently? He didn't know, but for the first time in a long time he wanted to find out. 6 months later, Bradley sat in the back row of courtroom 3B for what would be his final observation day. It was a Thursday morning, crisp and clear, and he'd arrived early as usual. But this time he wasn't here to testify. He was here to learn, and that made all the difference. The courtroom looked the same as it had that first shocking day. Same wooden benches, same American flag in the corner, same seal on the wall behind the judge's bench. But Bradley saw it all differently now. He'd spent 5 previous days in this room over the past 6 months, watching, listening, and slowly understanding things he'd been blind to for years. Judge Hayes entered and everyone rose. Bradley had gotten used to seeing her in that black robe, commanding the room with quiet authority. It was hard to believe there'd been a time when he'd thought of her as just another person trying to dodge a ticket. "Please be seated," Judge Hayes said, and the morning session began. The first case was a young woman charged with petty theft. She'd stolen makeup from a drugstore, lipstick, foundation, mascara. Total value, $42. Bradley watched as she stood before the judge, trembling slightly. 6 months ago, Bradley would have seen this as simple and straightforward. Theft is theft. She broke the law, she faces consequences. End of story. But now he found himself wondering about the details. Why makeup? Why those specific items? What was happening in her life? Judge Hayes asked those exact questions. "Ms. Chen, can you tell me why you took these items?" The young woman's voice was barely audible. I have a job interview next week. My first real interview in 8 months. I've been unemployed and living in my car. I wanted to look presentable, but I don't have any money left after buying gas and food." Bradley felt something tighten in his chest. He'd pulled over people living in their cars before. Sometimes he'd seen the makeshift curtains in the windows, the bags of belongings in the back seat, but he'd never really thought about what it meant. The daily struggle, the loss of dignity, the desperate attempts to keep moving forward. "I know it was wrong," the young woman continued, tears streaming down her face now. "I know I should have just gone to the interview without makeup. I just wanted one thing to go right. I wanted to feel like a normal person for 1 hour." Judge Hayes was quiet for a moment. Then she spoke, her voice firm but not unkind. "Ms. Chen, what you did was against the law and we can't excuse that. But I also understand that people sometimes make poor choices when they're in desperate situations." She paused, considering. "Here's my ruling. I'm going to sentence you to 20 hours of community service. Additionally, I'm going to connect you with the county's employment assistance program. Help with job placement, interview preparation, and yes, they have a program that provides professional clothing for interviews." The young woman looked up, hope flickering across her face. "One more thing," Judge Hayes added. "I'm going to give you a conditional discharge. If you complete your community service and stay out of trouble for 6 months, this charge will be dismissed from your record. That way, when you're filling out job applications, you won't have to check the box that says you've been convicted of a crime." "Thank you," the young woman whispered. "Thank you so much, Your Honor." As she left the courtroom, Bradley found himself thinking about his observation days at the community dialogue sessions. Those Thursday evening meetings had been uncomfortable at first. Sitting in a circle with community members, hearing about their experiences with police, their fears, their frustrations. It had been hard to listen to without getting defensive. One woman had talked about her teenage son getting pulled over 3 times in 1 month, always being asked to step out of the car, always being questioned about where he was going and what he was doing. "He's a good kid," she'd said, her voice breaking. "He gets straight A's. He volunteers at the library. But every time he sees a police car, he gets scared. And that breaks my heart because police are supposed to make us feel safe, not afraid." Bradley had wanted to explain that police have to be careful, that they're just doing their job, that if her son wasn't doing anything wrong, then he had nothing to worry about. But then he'd remembered Judge Hayes in that hallway, trying to explain her situation while he talked over her. So instead of defending himself, Bradley had just listened, really listened. By the third session, he'd started to share his own experiences, the fear he sometimes felt on night shifts, the difficulty of making split-second decisions, the weight of knowing that one mistake could cost lives. And something surprising had happened. People had listened to him too. They hadn't excused bad behavior, but they'd tried to understand the human being behind the badge. Now, back in the courtroom, Judge Hayes was calling another case. This one involved a teenager who'd been caught with spray paint, suspected of tagging buildings in the downtown area. The arresting officer gave his testimony, and Bradley recognized the tone, confident, certain, already convinced of the kid's guilt. But Judge Hayes dug deeper. She asked about the teenager's school record, his home life, his interests. She discovered he was actually a talented artist who'd won awards in school competitions. The spray painting wasn't random vandalism. He'd been painting murals, elaborate designs that actually had artistic merit, even if they were illegal. Talent doesn't excuse breaking the law, Judge Hayes told the teenager. But talent also shouldn't be wasted. I'm going to sentence you to community service, but I'm going to make it specific. I want you to work with the city's mural arts program. They have legal walls where artists can paint. Your job will be to help create a community mural under their supervision. The teenager's eyes lit up. His mother, sitting in the gallery, started crying with relief. Bradley thought about all the times he'd seen teenagers with spray paint and automatically assumed the worst. How many young artists had he arrested without ever asking about their dreams or their talents? How many opportunities for redemption had he missed because he was too busy categorizing people as criminals? The morning session ended, and as people filed out, Bradley stayed seated. Judge Hayes was gathering her files when she noticed him still there. "Officer Thompson," she said, stepping down from the bench. "This is your last observation day, isn't it?" Bradley stood. "Yes, Your Honor. 6 months, as you requested." Judge Hayes walked toward him, her expression curious. "And what did you learn?" It was a simple question, but the answer was so complex that Bradley hardly knew where to start. How could he explain that these 6 months had changed not just how he did his job, but how he saw the world? "I learned that I was wrong," Bradley said finally. "Not just about you in that hallway, but about a lot of things. I learned that everyone has a story, and if I don't take the time to hear it, I'm not really serving anyone." Judge Hayes nodded. "That's a good start, but learning it and living it are two different things. The real test comes tomorrow, and the day after that, and the day after that. When you're tired, when you've had a long shift, when someone is being difficult, can you still remember to see them as a person?" "I don't know," Bradley admitted, "but I want to try. And I think wanting to try is more than I had 6 months ago." "It is," Judge Hayes agreed. She was quiet for a moment, then added, "I got a call from your sergeant last month. He told me you've been mentoring some of the younger officers, teaching them about community policing, about taking time to listen. That's good work, Bradley." Bradley felt his face warm with the compliment. "I just figured if I learned something valuable, I should share it." "That's exactly right. Change doesn't just happen one person at a time. It happens when people who've learned and grown take the time to teach others." Judge Hayes extended her hand. "Thank you for taking this seriously. Thank you for being willing to change." Bradley shook her hand. "Thank you for giving me the chance, and for not filing that complaint. You could have ended my career that day." "I didn't want to end your career," Judge Hayes said. "I wanted to improve it." "There's a difference." As Bradley left the courthouse that day, he passed a young officer he'd been mentoring, a rookie named Collins who was just 6 months out of the academy. Collins was on his way in for a case. "Hey, Thompson," Collins said. "Any advice?" First time testifying. Bradley thought about all the advice he used to give. Be confident. Don't let the defense attorney rattle you. Stick to your report. All of it was still true, but it wasn't complete. Just tell the truth, Bradley said. The whole truth, including anything that might help the defendant. Remember that you're not here to win. You're here to help justice happen, and justice requires the full picture. Collins nodded thoughtfully. Got it, thanks. Bradley walked to his patrol car and sat in the driver's seat for a moment before starting the engine. His radio crackled with traffic. A fender bender on Highway 50, a noise complaint on Maple Street, a welfare check needed on the east side. Normal calls. Routine stuff. The kind of things he dealt with every single day. But Bradley knew that nothing was really routine. Every call was a person. Every person was a story. and every story deserved to be heard. He pulled out of the parking lot and headed toward his patrol area. In his rearview mirror, he could see the courthouse growing smaller, but the lessons he'd learned inside those walls would stay with him, not just for the rest of his shift, but for the rest of his career. 6 months ago, he'd walked into that courthouse thinking he knew everything. He'd left it knowing that he still had a lot to learn, and somehow that felt like progress. Officer Bradley Thompson had learned the most important lesson of all, that being a good cop wasn't about knowing all the answers. It was about being willing to ask better questions. And most importantly, it was about taking the time to listen to the answers. The radio crackled again. Another call. Another person who needed help. Bradley picked up the radio and responded, Unit 47 en route. And this time he was ready, not just to respond to the call, but to truly serve the person behind it.